Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Thursday, January 2nd, 2025. All right, I hope everybody had a good new year. Unfortunately, we started with tragedy in the U.S., in New Orleans. We'll get into that attack. And of course, the ongoing tragedy in Gaza continues. Wednesday was a very violent day. The war in Ukraine continues to rage. But the first story we have here at the top of antiwar.com, U.S. military aid to Israel reaches $22 billion. So since October 7th, 2023, the U.S. has provided Israel with more than $22 billion in military aid. This was reported by Israel Hayom, and they cited data from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI. And this increased U.S. military aid to Israel has supported the genocidal war in Gaza, Israel's war in Lebanon, military operations in the occupied West Bank, and attacks on Syria, Iran, and Yemen. I mean, listen to all those countries and places I named. When I was writing this out, I was thinking, okay, so what exactly has the U.S. supported? Because it's beyond Gaza. All these places, again, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, attacks on Iran, Yemen. This is what the U.S. has funded and enabled over the past year and a few months now. So according to SIPRI, from 2019 to 2023, U.S. weapons accounted for 69% of Israel's arms imports. So that was 2019 to 2023. You see how reliant Israel is on U.S. weapons. But that number has increased. Now, today, U.S. weapons account for 78% of Israel's arms imports. So it really goes to show, without U.S. military aid, Israel's military wouldn't be able to function. It just goes to show how key this support is in enabling all of this. So if you remember, in October 2024, Brown University's Costs of War Project, they put out a report on U.S. military aid to Israel over the previous year. They put the number of military aid that the U.S. has provided at $17.9 billion. And they said that was the bare minimum, not the bare minimum, but that was what they could find. And of course, there's other things that haven't been announced. And that same goes for SIPRI, because their numbers line up with the cost of war. Because after Cost of War put out that report, Israel signed a $5 billion contract to buy F-15 fighter jets, and that is being funded by the U.S. So that's another $5 billion on top of the Cost of War numbers, and that gets to around the SIPRI number of $22 billion. Again, I think this is probably an undercount, but it does go to show how much the U.S. has given Israel since October 2023. And then there's the spending on U.S. military operations in support of Israel, the bombing campaign in Yemen, intercepting missiles from Iran, sending the missile defense to Israel, and all that stuff, and just the overall increased U.S. military presence in the Middle East. That's cost at least $4.8 billion. And again, one reason why I focus so much on Israel, on Gaza, is because as an American, this is all made possible by my government support, by my tax dollars funding it. And Israeli officials have been very candid about this. There is one report I always go to. An Israeli Air Force official told Haaretz that without military aid from the U.S., they could not sustain operations in Gaza for more than a few months. And that means that the one way this genocide could come to an end is if President Biden picks up the phone and tells Netanyahu to stop. The U.S. has that power over Israel, and he hasn't used it, obviously, and I don't expect Trump to use it either, unfortunately. All right, so the next one here. Israel kills dozens of Palestinians in Gaza on New Year's Day. So the Israeli military started the new year by massacring dozens of Palestinians in Gaza, killing at least 28 in attacks across the Strip since dawn on Wednesday. So this was throughout the day on Wednesday, January 1st. New Year's Day. So in northern Gaza, Israeli strikes hit a home in Jabalia, killing at least 15. And according to the Palestinian news agency Wafa, most of the dead were children. 7 Palestinians were also reported killed by an Israeli attack on a home east of Gaza City. In Khan Yunis, southern Gaza, at least 4 Palestinians were killed by Israeli strikes. And in the central Berej refugee camp, 2 were killed. Amid the Israeli strikes, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz threatened to increase attacks on Gaza in response to rocket fire from the Strip, which caused a little damage in Israel. Very minor rocket attacks coming from Gaza, but Katz is threatening to escalate. He said, quote, "I want to send a clear message from here to the heads of the terrorists in Gaza. If Hamas does not soon allow the release of the Israeli hostages from Gaza and continues firing at Israeli communities, it will face blows of an intensity not seen in Gaza for a long time," end quote. And you talk about, I mean, they've been very heavily bombing Gaza. We'll get into some numbers here, actually, of, the number of strikes over the past month. So on top of the strikes, of course, we have the horrendous living conditions for the Palestinian civilians, the displaced civilians living in tents. You see these kids here in a tent camp that's completely flooded. There's been heavy rains, cold temperatures. Babies are dying because of the exposure. And at least 7 Palestinian babies have died within about a week due to these conditions. And Gaza's health ministry, they put out their death toll update about midday. So I should have mentioned the 28 killed. These reports, these were medical, Palestinian medics speaking to Al Jazeera. In their daily update, the Gaza's health ministry said 12 Palestinians were killed and 41 were injured. And that was in the previous 48 hours. So there was actually a little bit of a lull in Israeli strikes. I noticed when I worked on New Year's Eve, I didn't do the show, but it didn't seem like there was much in Gaza. But then New Year's Day comes and boom, all these really heavy airstrikes again. And as we always mention, the health ministry only counts Palestinians that are brought to hospitals, and the medics and rescue workers usually have a higher number. They'll account for the people under the rubble and everything. So Al Jazeera reported, and I think this was actually put out by the Israeli military, that Israel conducted around 1,400 airstrikes across the Gaza Strip in the month of December. 1,400 strikes in December, averaging 45 a day. I mean, that's very heavy. And according to the health ministry's numbers, at least 1,170 Palestinians were killed in December. And again, their numbers are low because they only count the Palestinians brought to hospitals, the dead brought to the hospitals. So, but it goes to show it's been very heavy lately. A few dozen people killed every day. All right, so the next one here, we have a report from Gaza, what it's like to sleep in a damp, frigid tent. This is from Abu Bakr Abed at Drop Site News. So this is a Palestinian journalist in Gaza. I read this earlier. I can't really summarize it for you now, but there's lots of quotes in here from one of them, from the father of one of the babies who died due to the cold, and also doctors just talking about the living conditions and what it would take to solve this problem. I mean, not just a ceasefire, but they need to get building material in. They need to do a lot of work to make this place livable again. And of course, there's just no prospect of that happening. So it's just very bleak, dark. I mean, of course, it just feels silly even saying that it's bleak and dark times in Gaza. But, I'm trying to find a silver lining here, some hope for peace, but I just don't see one, unfortunately. All right, so the next one here, Israeli settler violence was the highest in 2024. So the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs said Wednesday that 2024 marked the worst year for Israeli settler violence in the West Bank and East Jerusalem since it began keeping track of such incidents nearly 20 years ago. So the UN office said that it recorded about 1,400 incidents of settler violence. There's that number again, 1,400 incidents of settler violence in 2024, which amounts to nearly 4 attacks per day. The incidents involved physical assaults, arson attacks, raids on Palestinian communities, and the destruction of fruit trees. That's mainly olive trees. Israeli settlers have been increasingly emboldened since the current Netanyahu government took power back in December 2022. The end of 2022, we're in 2025 now, was when this coalition government came in, which includes these guys like Bezalel Smotrich, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who are settlers themselves and have been long on record saying they want to annex the West Bank. They want to kick all the Palestinians out of there. And when this government first formed in 2022, they put out a statement saying that they were going to prioritize the expansion of settlements with the ultimate goal of annexation. So after they came in, they also stepped up military raids in the West Bank, and then the settlers were really emboldened. And then after October 7th, they were emboldened even more because all the attention's on Gaza, and they could just do what they want. And amid this violence, the Netanyahu government has approved major Israeli land grabs in the occupied territories. And the UN office said that 2024 marked the second deadliest year for Palestinians in the West Bank since it began recording casualties, following 2023. 2023 was the deadliest year. And it was one of the deadliest years in decades before October 7th. One of the deadliest years for Palestinian children in a long time in the West Bank. So this was all happening before October 7th. And most of those killed by Palestinians killed in the West Bank in 2024 were killed by the Israeli military. The UN office said, quote, more than 480 Palestinians, including 91 children, have been killed across the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Most of them were killed by Israeli forces, end quote. The office added that Palestinians from the West Bank killed 35 Israelis, including 3 children, either in the West Bank or in Israel. The incoming Trump administration is expected to be incredibly supportive of Israel's plans to continue stealing land in the West Bank. President-elect Donald Trump's pick to serve as ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, is an outspoken proponent of Israel completely taking over the West Bank, which he calls Judea and Samaria. He believes, they have... God gave this land to the modern state of Israel, and there's no such thing as a settlement. He says, he's even said there's no such thing as a Palestinian. This is who Trump picks to be the ambassador to Israel. And it's similar to the guy now. I'm blanking on his name, the current U.S. ambassador to Israel. But essentially, U.S. ambassadors to Israel, at least recently, since I've been really following this stuff, are essentially act essentially as Israeli ambassadors to the U.S. They are completely, I'm blanking on the current guy's name, but I know, in some of these leaked documents about these foreign assistance laws being violated by Israel, committing all these war crimes, the U.S. ambassador to Israel is saying, oh, don't worry about it. Keep sending him the aid. We got to keep sending him aid. And Huckabee, of course, is going to be just like that. Trying to influence the U.S. to give Israel whatever it wants, especially when it comes to taking over the West Bank. All right, so the next one here, Palestinian Authority shuts down Al-Jazeera in the occupied West Bank. This article is from The Cradle. So the Palestinian Authority announced on January 1st the suspension of Al-Jazeera's operations in the occupied West Bank, citing alleged violations of Palestinian laws. So this is more crackdown from the Palestinian Authority. The official Palestinian news agency Wafa stated that the decision resulted from Al Jazeera's, quote, manipulation, interference in internal affairs, and dissemination of misleading and incendiary reports, end quote. The PA said the suspension was temporary pending the network's compliance with legal regulations. Al Jazeera condemned the decision and linked it to a broader campaign against its journalists, including its correspondent, Mohammed Al-Atrash. The decision follows the Qatari network's critical coverage of the PA's assault on the Palestinian resistance in the Jenin refugee camp. So this comes amid these PA operations against the resistance groups in Jenin. And apparently the Al Jazeera coverage, the Al Jazeera Arabic coverage has been critical of that. And now the PA moves to shut them down. And of course, Israel shut down Al Jazeera inside Israel. So this inner Palestinian fighting in the West Bank, I think this totally all benefits Israel, and the U.S. seems to be pushing this. They're asking Israel to supply more, military aid to the PA and everything. And the Palestinian Authority forces did recently kill the journalist in the West Bank, Shatha Sabag. So, we see so many Palestinian journalists get killed by Israel, and now one being killed by the Palestinian security forces. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. launches airstrikes on Yemen. So this is from Tuesday. Yeah, Tuesday. U.S. Central Command announced that its warships and planes launched a series of strikes against Yemen, targeting the capital Sana'a and coastal areas. According to Al-Mayadeen, at least 8 U.S. strikes hit Sana'a, and targets included buildings used by Yemen's defense ministry. It's unclear if there are any casualties. A few days now after, it doesn't seem like there was. CENTCOM said the strikes took place on Monday and Tuesday. They claim they hit a Houthi command and control facility. And they also said they intercepted cruise missiles and drones over the Red Sea. The Houthis said that they launched a big attack on U.S. ships during these airstrikes. So this continues. It goes to show these bombing campaigns are not deterring the Houthis, not slowing them down. And they put out a very defiant message after these U.S. strikes. Mohammed Abdul Salam said, he's a spokesman for the Houthis, who are officially known as Ansar Allah. He said, quote, "The U.S. aggression on Yemen is a blatant violation of the sovereignty of an independent state and blatant support for Israel to encourage it to continue its crime of genocide against the people of Gaza. We affirm that Yemen, with its great sacrifices, continues to defend itself in the face of any aggression, and that it is steadfast in its position supporting Gaza," end quote. So in recent weeks, the Houthis have been able to get missiles past Israeli air defenses, and Israel has stepped up its bombing on Yemen. And there's all these threats. Israeli officials are really threatening to escalate in Yemen. But Yemen is far, so all they can really do is launch these rounds of airstrikes. All right, so the next one here, Hezbollah threatens retaliation if Israel stays past deadline. This article is from Jason Ditz. He wrote this up on New Year's Eve. So now, 35 days into a 60-day ceasefire, Israeli troops remain inside Lebanese territory and are increasingly open about staying indefinitely, basically saying that they might stay past the 60 days. They've been bombing Lebanon. Over 35 Lebanese have been killed since this so-called ceasefire went into effect. Hezbollah hasn't really done anything in response. There was in one case, they fired a couple rockets in like an open area. But now a Hezbollah official is saying that the group is being patient, but on day 61 of the 60-day ceasefire, any Israeli troops still inside Lebanon will be considered occupation forces and will come, essentially saying that they're going to start really attacking them. And so, Israel's even moved deeper into Lebanon. They've pulled out of some villages, but in other areas, they've moved further in. And again, this is day 35. So he wrote this. So now it's day 37 of the ceasefire. So the 60 days is coming up rather quickly. All right. So the next one here about the New Orleans attack. The FBI says the New Orleans attacker was an Army veteran with an ISIS flag. So this is what the FBI is saying. As a lot of people pointed out to me on Twitter, you shouldn't trust the FBI, but it's important, I think, to cover what they're saying. And, it does look like this guy was radicalized in some way, although there's not really much public information about him. But here, we'll get into it. This is what the FBI is saying, what all other media reports are saying. I think I covered the most important points here. Of course, there's so much out about this now. But here we go. The FBI said Wednesday that the man who drove a truck into a crowd in New Orleans to kill as many people as he could was a Texas-born U.S. Army veteran who was carrying an ISIS flag. The early morning New Year's Day attack in the French Quarter killed at least 15 people and injured more than 30, so a complete tragedy. And I believe the death toll could rise, is what they're saying. There could be more dead. I mean, this is the French Quarter. This was on Bourbon Street on New Year's Day, early in the morning. It was like 3 a.m. So there's a lot of people out. And this guy rammed a Ford I think it was a Ford truck, rammed it and just slaughtered all these people. And he was killed in a shootout with the cops afterward. He jumped out. So he was identified. His name is Shamsud Din Jabbar. Again, a U.S. Army veteran, Texas-born. So he's an American. The FBI said in a statement that weapons, including potential improvised explosive devices or IEDs, and an ISIS flag were found inside the vehicle. The FBI said other potential IEDs were found in the French Quarter, and Jabbar was likely not acting alone. One special agent in charge of the New Orleans field office said that they don't believe Jabbar was solely responsible. There was reports saying that investigators reviewed a video that allegedly showed 3 men and a woman placing an IED in the area, but the FBI later ruled out them as suspects, so I guess that's not what the video showed. The Sugar Bowl, which is the annual college football game held in New Orleans on New Year's Day, was postponed to Thursday, so that was a sign maybe they were expecting more attacks or something. And then another strange thing happened on Wednesday. A Tesla Cybertruck exploded at a Trump hotel in Las Vegas, killing the driver and injuring 7 people nearby. Officials said the truck contained fireworks-style mortars, and the incident is being investigated as a potential terrorist attack. According to reports, both the Cybertruck and the Ford truck used in the attack in New Orleans were rented using the app Turo, which is a car rental app. Could just be a coincidence, but it's just kind of strange that these things happen on the same day. And again, we don't really know anything about there might be more updates as I'm recording this, but as far as I know, the Cybertruck blew up. They say it was detonated in some way. We don't really know anything beyond that. No identity of the driver, at least as far as I'm aware of right now. So back to the New Orleans attack, the FBI said that it was working to determine Jabbar's potential associations and affiliations with terrorist organizations. Sources told CNN that investigators have found writings that the FBI believes supports investigators' view that the attack was inspired by ISIS. In comments on the attack, President Biden said, quote, "The FBI also reported to me that mere hours before the attack, he posted videos on social media indicating that he's inspired by ISIS, expressing a desire to kill," end quote. So that's what President Biden's saying. And a spokesman for the U.S. Army said that Jabbar was in the Army from 2007 to 2020. From 2007 to 2015, he served as a human resources specialist and information technology specialist on active duty. He was deployed to Afghanistan once during that time. And from 2015 to 2020, he was in the reserve. So he was in the Army for a long time. So the exact motive is unclear. Again, this is all what we're hearing from the FBI and Biden. As far as, publicly available information about this guy, there's not much. I haven't seen anything like posts of his or anything indicating he was an ISIS guy or anything like that. There was one video he put out a few years ago introducing himself as a real estate agent, saying, he was from the area in Texas. He was in the military for a long time. Seemed like a normal guy. But a U.S. official told ABC News that authorities believe Jabbar was radicalized in recent years, and the Israel-Hamas war, as they call it, may have exacerbated his radicalization. So again, the motive, we don't know exactly what it is, but this comes after more than a year of the U.S. backing Israel's genocidal war in Gaza, and support for Israel has historically been a motive for terrorist attacks against the U.S., and this has been the most violent period in that history in Israel's history. And the U.S. is supporting it. So, attacks like this, of course, everybody's got their theories about what's going on here. If this guy's really ISIS, or what, if the FBI is trying to spin something here or not. But, this is, it could be as simple as, this is someone who was radicalized by these atrocities that the U.S. is supporting overseas, and he decided to kill some innocent Americans about it. Again, everybody's got their theories, and I'm curious what yours is. I'm just telling you what the FBI is saying. And another thing, when it comes to ISIS, it's not necessary. Let's say he was affiliated or loyal, say he declared his loyalty to ISIS or something. It doesn't necessarily mean ISIS over in Syria or the ISIS-K guys in Afghanistan, directed this attack. This could just be a guy who was a nut and decided to do this and declare he was loyal to ISIS. There's a lot of cases like that. But when it comes to ISIS, the U.S. has stepped up its airstrikes against them. But on the other hand, they've also helped Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. They helped them take over Syria. They have a similar ideology to ISIS. I'm sure a lot of ISIS fighters have merged with HTS, so the whole situation in Syria is a mess. But we'll see how this shapes out if we find out more information. I hope that there's more evidence that we can see of what this guy was actually saying and that we just don't have to take the FBI's word for everything. But just a horrific tragedy to start the new year in New Orleans. So, and we'll see again with the Tesla, the Cybertruck explosion. We'll see in the coming days what comes out about that as well. All right, so the next one here, Ivory Coast says French troops to leave the country. This article is from Al-Jazeera. So the Ivory Coast has announced that French troops will leave the country this month after a decades-long military presence, becoming the latest African nation to downscale military ties with its former colonizer. In an end-of-the-year address to the nation on Tuesday, President Alassane Ouattara said the 43rd Bima Marine Infantry Battalion in Abidjan, where French troops were stationed, will be handed over to Ivory Coast's armed forces as of January 2025. The president said, quote, "We can be proud of our army whose modernization is now effective. It is in this context that we have decided on the concerted and organized withdrawal of French forces," end quote. So France, whose colonial rule in West Africa ended in the 1960s, has nearly 1,000 soldiers in Ivory Coast. And Ivory Coast is the latest West African nation to expel French troops after Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. And then in November, within hours of each other, Senegal and Chad also announced the departure of French soldiers from their soil. So this is 6 West African countries now where France has been kicked out of. So the U.S. also was kicked out of Niger, and that withdrawal actually happened. I thought they were going to maybe take some extreme measures to stay, but they ended up leaving. So, and on December 26th, France returned its first military base to Chad, the latest Sahel nation to host French troops. So the Chad withdrawal, I think, is over, or it's in the process. But anyway, France continues to get kicked out of these African countries. All right, so the next one here, Russian gas flow to Europe through Ukraine ends. So Russian gas deliveries to Europe through a Ukrainian pipeline will end on January 1st. I wrote this on New Year's Eve. As a 5-year agreement signed in 2019 expires at the end of 2024, Russian gas continued to flow through a Soviet-era pipeline following the Russian invasion of Ukraine under a deal that was signed back in 2019 between Gazprom, which is Russia's state gas company, and Naftogaz, which is Ukraine's state-run gas company. And there were no orders for new gas, so it's been shut down. So again, I wrote this the day before, but it's done. The gas flow through this pipeline is done. And Ukraine chose not to renew the agreement, and this has angered Slovakia, which received Russian gas through the Ukrainian pipeline. The pipeline would go from Slovakia. In Slovakia, it split into branches and took gas to Austria and the Czech Republic. Slovakia's Prime Minister, Robert Fico, who's an opponent of the NATO proxy war in Ukraine, he warned that Slovakia could take reciprocal measures in response to Ukraine not renewing the deal. He said those measures could include cutting electricity exports to Ukraine. Ukraine seems to have waved off these threats. They say they're not worried about it happening and that Poland can make up for some of the power. We'll see what happens with that. Slovakia, as far as I understand it, they're not expected to really face any shortages or anything like that due to this. They're going to, they can import more from Hungary, Poland, and Austria. But it will, the government's not happy about it. Fico really tried to stop this, but Ukraine ended up going through with it anyway, not renewing this deal to let the Russian gas continue to flow. And this was one reason why Ukraine was so against the Nord Stream pipelines, was all the money that they made transporting Russian gas through this pipeline. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from James Carden, Trump must heed the Bromwich Principle. One from Yves Engler, why does the Canadian military help bomb Yemen? One from Haaretz, the Israeli paper's editorial board, Israel's violent land thieves have set their sights on even more of the West Bank. One from William D. Hartung, big tech isn't going to solve our problems. And one from Aaron Mate at his Substack, the U.S. helps Syria's al-Qaeda offshoot while punishing Syria's people. So he gets into the sanctions there. One thing I haven't really been covering is that the U.S., these very crippling economic sanctions that the U.S. has on Syria. So go check that all out. Go check out our blog. We have Kyle Anzalon's show, Conflicts of Interest, in there. Some other good posts. And again, I hope everyone had a good new year. We had fun over here. Let's hope this is a more peaceful year than 2024. Sorry I didn't have any good news to start the new year with. For a while I was trying to think of ways to make my show more positive, and I do want to get into more kind of activist stuff, activism that we could do that might actually move the needle. And one of those things is defend the guard, which I need to talk about more. But this is just what it is. The U.S. empire, the war, it's violent, it's bad, it's sad. It's just what we cover here. And I think that's all right. It's just a reality that people should be more aware of anyway. I mean, you look at the journalists in Gaza, it's not like they're just laying down and dying. So it's, you got to keep, we just got to keep trying to make people aware of this stuff and hoping that it'll change. Anyway, Happy New Year. Happy 2025. Follow us on all the social media, like, comment, subscribe. All that stuff helps out. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.